Good evening, everyone. This is yours truly, Nodella Jordan, and my co-host, Derek Walker. Say hi, Derek.
Good evening, everyone.
All right, so we're still faced with the challenge of being able to have Derek and I both live, do the live video at the same time. We thought we figured it out, but we quite still haven't figured it out. So he's calling in again tonight. Hopefully you'll be able to hear him clearly. We want to thank you so very much for tuning in to Intimate Talk, where this is a broadcast for grown folk, because we have grown folk conversations. All right. So no kids should be up here, because we really talk about some serious situations. There's no holds bar, obviously. This is a respectful broadcast because we both are Christians. We're ministers. So you won't be hearing any crazy language talking like that. So Derek, I think you need to turn down your volume because you're coming through on my phone. I'm coming through again on my phone.
Okay, is that better?
Yes. All right. Okay. So tonight we're going to talk about the bond or bondage of intimacy. And, once again, this broadcast ultimately is based off the foundation of my book, The Intimate Place, My God, My Man, Myself. And our goal is to bring us all into a healthy lifestyle to where we can enjoy intimacy without feeling embarrassed, without feeling inadequate, without feeling ashamed. But I want us all to get to a place of confidence in our intimacy, not just with our significant other, but for those of us who believe in God, but to get comfortable and confident with God, and then also with ourselves, our family, and our friends. Many people are struggling with having intimacy as part of their relationship because most of us did not grow up understanding the importance of intimacy being part of our relationship. Most of us didn't even grow up where the terminology intimacy was used, because society on whole taught us that intimacy is sex and sex is intimacy. So whenever somebody did use the word intimate, it usually inferred or referred to that individual wanted to have sex. And so the purpose of my book and this broadcast is to create a forum for us grown-ups to be able to come and have a real discussion on our thoughts concerning intimacy, on how we can individually improve our lives of intimacy. Derek, you want to have something to say?
Not yet.
Okay.
I'm listening.
Okay, great. All right. So tonight, once again, we're going to talk about the bond or bondage of intimacy. And many people don't realize that, first and foremost, when you decide to be intimate, whether it's spiritually, emotionally, mentally, verbally, non-sexually, physical, and then sexually physical, there's automatically a bond that's attached to any of those types of intimacies and relationships. The other thing we need to understand is that when we decide we want to incorporate intimacy in our life, it creates a relationship between you and whatever it is that you're desiring to have intimacy with. Derek?
With that being said, you are so right. In any relationship, a bond is very important, and that's what sustains the relationship or even the marriage for that case.
Yeah.
With a bond, you can talk, you can discuss, and there's a closeness.
Yes. Yes. And so even today I was watching, I wasn't even really watching. I was listening to, I forgot some new talk show. I forgot the lady's name. And she had some single women up there who had divorced and they're still single. And it was because they struggled in creating that bond. One lady, she had already been married twice, and she was on her way to being married a third time, but it didn't work out. And so the show host had began to dive into why was it like that. But then she moved on to another young 10 years, and she also struggled with being able to have successful relationships. And one of the things that it was discovered is that her insecurities was keeping her from having successful relationships, which in turn technically meaning that she was bond with the opposite sex because even though she desired to have a relationship, her insecurity. So when we have insecurities, and we talked about that a couple of episodes ago or broadcasts ago, about how we have to reach a place of being able to form a bond in how we're able to understand each other. Derek, help me out. My thoughts is escaping me.
So I guess the key thing is in intimacy, true intimacy, a bond has to be developed.
Yes.
And it's not an overnight process, because it's getting to know that person inside and out.
Yes.
When you develop a bond with an individual in a relationship, in a marriage, your bond goes to the point where that you will actually want to, you'll pretty much, as they used to say in the old times, you would pretty much can say what that person's getting ready to say before they say it, because you know that person.
Yes. Yes. And that's something that I personally have experienced in, throughout the relationships that I've had in my life is that, we had gotten so close. We had formed such a strong and tight bond to where I knew some of their thoughts and they knew some of my thoughts. And, this is all helping us to build, not just only have good moments of intimacy, but I'm talking about creating a life of intimacy where there's no struggle. And, I made the distinction some time ago, and it's written in my book. I think I did write that part in my book. I wrote a good bit. Whereas when you are in this cycle of having just moments of intimacy, usually those moments of intimacy you have to plan. But when you have a life of intimacy involves a lot of spontaneous intimacy. And this is where I want us to get of having a spontaneous, and everything don't always have to be planned out. Derek, how was your experience with that in your relationships?
I think the best intimacy is the unplanned one, because there's no hold bars, there's no time constraints. It's something that you do at the spur of the moment, because it develops that feeling of intimacy, of what you specifically, how close you are, that bond you have with that individual, that you want to spend time with them, not just cuddling, but holding hands, talking over dinner. I mean, spur of the moment intimacy is probably one of the best intimacies that I've always experienced, because planned things don't always go as they are planned.
Right.
And I think one of the things in relationships is that we know that throughout the course of the day, we may have things planned, but all of a sudden they're subject to change.
Right.
But if things that you don't plan seem to be the most fun and the most memorable, because when you don't plan it, it's a surprise to either you or the other person.
Yes.
So the other person, in most cases, will say, "I didn't know that you thought this way. I thought that you forgot about what it is to be spontaneous." Right. And a relationship, spontaneous is always good, because the person never knows what to expect. That good is going to be coming out of it.
And I do understand, for those of you, hold on, I just wanted to share the broadcast so people will know that we are live.
I think the best intimacy is the unplanned one, because There's no hold bars. There's no time constraint.
Nope, sorry.
Spontaneous is always good because the person never knows what to expect. That good is going to be coming out of it.
And I do understand for those of you, hold on, I just wanted to share the broadcast. So, okay. Derek, you still there? Derek?
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I'm here.
And I agree. And I know, so for those of you who like to plan things, this is not to say that you should never plan anything, but I just wanted to show a comparison of when you have moments of intimacy versus a life of intimacy. Moments of intimacy, you do once again have to plan them more specifically, you know, perhaps around your schedules and things of that nature. It's not to say that it still can't be successful, but when it comes to a life of intimacy, you don't limit yourself to, oh, well, am I available or are they available? Because if you know each other, going back to that bonding piece, when you have that bond, you most likely will know that person's schedule. They will know your schedule. You will also know their dislikes and likes, and they will know your likes and dislikes. And so when it comes to a life of intimacy, you allow at a moment's notice, okay, oh, well, can you pencil me in at 3 o'clock, or can you pencil me in at, but when we create, now understand, we are going to transition from moments of intimacy to a life of intimacy. So many are based on moments of intimacy, and I'm talking about even between spouses. You know, I got a meeting at this time and I got a meeting at that time. How about we get together at this time? Okay, but desire and goal is to get each of us to that point of not always having those moments of intimacy, but creating, once again, a life of intimacy where at any moment's notice, we're not talking about, this is not limited to see. And, you know, I may say, let's say if Derek and I was in a relationship and we're just sitting there and say, hey, Derek, let's go for a walk on the beach, or let's go run to the movies, or let's go do this, or let's go do that. We can do that because we've created a life of intimacy for ourselves. Now, if we were still in the mode of moments of intimacy, I would then have to there, or, you know, what is your, you know, moments of intimacy have some restrictions, as opposed to a life of intimacy have no restrictions. And once again, you can only going through the moments of intimacy. As you go through those moments of intimacy, we should be consciously building those moments of intimacy to become a life of intimacy, so that there's not so much planning. And once again, if you want to plan, that's fine, but also don't dismiss embracing or developing, creating a life of intimacy. Derek?
You know, Nadella, I want to add to that because you are so right. And the thing of even planning, one of the things I find and I see and I hear quite difficult in a lot of marriages is that they fall apart, or relationships, because they fall apart because people tend to forget that you still need to make time for the other person.
Yes.
And restrictions sometimes are restricting.
Yes.
Because you have to remember that in building and getting to know a person, sometimes most people, and me growing up, let's say that most people spend a lot of time getting to know their mate or who they're going to be with.
Yes.
Those marriages or relationships tend to last longer.
Yes.
Now people do the spur of the moment relationships, which means they don't have time for the person. They have a minute for the person. They don't know the person. And then when the person is out there looking for something else, it's because you're not able to provide that growth or that time to really get to know them. I think that most people in relationships fail to fail to duplicate the fact that you need to get to know the person. In any relationship or any bond, you want to know who you're dealing with. You want to know if you can trust that person. You want to know if that person is somebody you can consider yourself spending a lifetime with or a duration of time with. Even friends that I've grown up with, developed a bond.
Yes.
And developing a bond with those individuals, they know intimate secrets about me.
Yes.
Because I can tell them that and I don't have to worry about it being blabbered all over the place.
Yes.
And so I think that people have to understand it's a difference between spur of the moment doing versus over time doing.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to remember that you still have to include time for that individual, because if you don't give that person the time that they need to require to grow the relationship,
mm-hmm.
then you're not growing anything, because that person's going to be out there looking for something else.
And this is why it's very important. So once again, for those of you who are just turning, tonight we're going to be talking about the bond or bondage of intimacy. And we're talking about this because, as Derek even just shared, is that a lot of people are entering into relationships and even going as far as getting married, but they don't have that bond. And the only knowledge or understanding of intimacy pretty much will be limited to the sexual intimacy, failing to realize, as well as I believe they're robbing themselves of the spiritual intimacy, of the mental intimacy, of the emotional intimacy, of the verbal intimacy, the non-sexual physical intimacy. But when you build or create a bond between each other, intimacy is automatic within that relationship, and you do begin to learn each other's ways. And, once again, you're building also a life of intimacy as you get to know each other. But the problem is that, as Derek said, is that a lot of people aren't taking that time to get to know that individual, even if marriage isn't on your mind, just still, because keeping in mind what intimate or intimacy means. It means to have close relations. It means to have to be close friends. So if you are building a bond, you are definitely going to end up being close friends. And I also agree with Derek, is growing up, I didn't have a lot of friends. I was usually a one-on-one person when it came to friends. And truthfully, I can honestly say I've only had 3 best friends out of my 50 plus years of life. And that's because that's the kind of person that I am. You have to build that rapport with me in order for me to trust you. And so, with my friends, yes, there are certain things that I've shared with them that I did not have to worry about them going back, telling everybody like they're doing now on social media. And we understood the friendship that we had. We understood the bond that we have. And so our goal tonight is to help each of us to either discover whether we have a bond with anybody, or to help you to build a bond or to strengthen that bond with that significant other, with that family member, with a friend. Because what people don't understand is that when you build a bond, when you create a bond, there's also another terminology that's called soul tie. So when you build a bond, or when you build a soul tie with someone, that's not something that we should take lightly. And from the spiritual perspective, when it comes to a soul tie, when 2 people enter into a relationship, sexual or non-sexual, you can't just walk away. That's why it's called a soul tie. You are actually connected to each other spiritually through soul tie. And so when you find that person in your life, whether it be that they just end up being a BFF, or if they end up being a significant other, understanding the kind of bond that you've created will only help your relationship later on. In developing this soul tie as well, once again, intimacy unconsciously for many of us is unconscious for many of us, but I want us to become conscious about everything we do concerning intimacy. Why? Because I want us to get the fullest enjoyment out of intimacy. And when we are unconscious to it, we're not going to get the fullest enjoyment out of it that we can.
You know, one of the things, Adela, that is funny, I always call it theft by deception. And when I say theft by deception, that means people enter into a relationship, but they're not upfront, and they provide false pretenses to get their foot in the door.
Yes.
Then when the other person find out that person is not who they say they are, then it becomes a problem.
Yes.
Versus, I mean, you don't share all of your intimate thoughts or your intimate business in the beginning.
Definitely.
But I think there are certain things that are most important that you need to be upfront with. Because it's easier for a person to make their own decision of whether they want to deal with you or not. Then they find out down the road something differently, and then they're running.
Right.
Because they don't know how to take you. So I think that's part of bond building, is that, you know, certain things you have to discuss. Right.
Right. And so the talk show that I was listening to today, so the first lady who had already been married twice, and she was about to be married a third time, but the guy left her at the altar. It was discovered that she never built a bond with them. Understand that she was into them, but they would never get into her the same way that she was into them. So if you want to call that a bond, that was a one-way bond, or that was a lopsided or one-sided bond. And I'm trying to remember the talk show host name. And she was telling her, she was like, you're coming off as if you're desperate. And she says, you can't go rushing into these relationships and you're saying, okay, here, all of this, but then they offer you nothing back. And so now you're left brokenhearted. And this is what's happening with a lot of us is that we don't have these bonds, or these bonds are one-sided. And then when the relationship falls apart, then you're crushed and you're wondering, well, what happened? Because you didn't have a real bond. And this woman thought she had a bond with these men. But the thing with this is that she may have had a bond with them, but they didn't have a bond with her. Because if that's the case, then she wouldn't have been on marriage number 3. And so the fault actually lied within her, that she was forming these bonds with these men, and she was getting married to these men, not even having known them that long. And so here we are, when we look at the divorce rate today, in the church, out of the church, the divorce rate is so high, it's ridiculous. I don't even think they have a fully accurate number. They're just kind of guesstimating at this point, because people, 1 minute they get married, who was in 72 hours, or they annulled the marriage in 72 hours. But she was, the marriage was annulled in 72 hours. What were y'all thinking? There obviously could not have been a bond, and there definitely was not a true intimate relationship there, because intimacy, ultimately, it helps you to get through those rough times, because when you understand what intimacy really is, once again, we're talking about forming a bond or having a soul tie. You don't just up and walk away from a relationship because she burnt the chicken, or because he didn't clean the bathroom the way that you like. Well, y'all should have taken the time to find out their living habits, their cooking habits. Derek?
I think that's one of the key things that you just said, is that you don't know a person until you actually live with a person, and then you still really don't know a person until you marry a person. I think one of the biggest things or biggest mistakes in relationships is you don't know the person's habit, how the person lives.
Yes.
We're so scared of getting to know the family members or getting to know the people that surround the people that we don't know anything about the person.
Right.
And so I used to like the philosophy, birds of a feather flock together.
Yes.
Because sometimes you watch, if you maneuver and happen to go in company of those people, you will see exactly how your specific person or your mate may respond in that particular crowd to see if they're comfortable.
Yes.
I mean, I've learned that in any crowd of people, you're going to find somebody who just sticks out like a sore thumb. That means that person's not meant for that crowd of people.
Yes.
But I think the other thing is, the hardest thing in a relationship is when you're in a relationship, some of those crowds we have to learn to let go.
Yes.
spending time in a crowd of people because you have jealous people.
Yes.
People hate to see other people happy or, happily in a relationship because they're miserable.
Right.
People used to have that philosophy, misery loves company.
Yes.
I had to learn to stop always listening to people's relationship problems.
Yes.
Because if they come to me and they talk about a relationship and you give them advice and they go back and then they turn around and they got the same problem, that means they didn't listen to you in the first place.
Yes. And I dealt with that. Mm-hmm.
And so then it's time for you to analyze, should you keep giving that person advice if they didn't take advice the first time?
Exactly.
And so, but even in family dynamics.
Yeah.
Mother told you to do something and you didn't do it. Either you got a beating or you got some kind of punishment.
Yes.
Well, God does the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's going to come back around in a different cycle and maybe even a different way, but it's going to come back around until either you accept it and you get it right, or you're going to keep experiencing the same thing.
Right.
People in and out of relationships are in and out of relationships for a reason.
Yes.
They have trust issues.
Yes.
They have bonding issues.
Yes.
And they really just don't want anybody to tell them that they're wrong or they need to fix something.
Right.
And we're so busy trying to cater to a sexual need
that
we're not paying attention to their emotional and mental needs. And that's how we leave people broken.
Yes.
Because if you leave with somebody that really needed you, not for sexual, but for emotional support.
Yes.
And you actually go in and it turns into a sexual relationship. When that person leaves you, they're even more emotionally torn than they were before you even got involved with them.
Yes. Yes.
So we need to be very careful that, in and out of relationships. Fix yourself first. That's the key thing, because if you can take an emotional baggage from one place to the other place, all you're doing is picking up more emotional baggage.
And that's what the host of the show today had told the woman. She said, now you've been married twice and you almost had a third failed marriage. She said, doesn't that say something to you? And so the lady is sitting there. She's kind of like, although she said yes, you can tell her real response was no. And so
I call those people self-righteous people because they can see fault in everybody else, but everything they do is perfect, and it's not.
But the thing of it is that, but it was, and I understand that point, but the problem is that she couldn't see that she was the problem. It was really internally that she was in search for something, but yet she needed to deal with herself first. And so she was on this quest to find love. And I understand that, because most everybody do want to find love, special person. That if you are already damaged goods, let's be honest, if you are already damaged goods, why are you sitting here searching for relationships without fixing yourself first? And I wouldn't be surprised that the third almost husband realized that she was broken, or she was fragile, or she was fractured or damaged goods, or whatever the case may be. And he took off. They never know why he left, but just she was being asked certain questions. She couldn't quite answer the questions. Yes, there is no year, I guess. I mean, shoot, a 5-year-old could see what the issue is. And she would not come to terms with herself. And her daughter kept telling her, Mom, you need to come to terms with yourself. And so she refused. And so she ended up going through these cycles of relationships. And once again, she was forming these bonds with these men, but they weren't healthy bonds, because she was immediately latching onto these men. And I'm like, who immediately latches onto somebody? Now, I'm not going to say there is no such thing as love at first sight. I can't speak to that. I'm not going to say it's not possible. There are people who say that they met their significant other and it was love at first sight. Then God bless you. But for the majority of us, it really is not love at first sight. We do have to build a bond, and it takes time. And we ain't talking about a couple of days or a couple of weeks or even a couple of months, where it takes to build. Not if you want a solid bond with that individual. If you really want your relationship to work with that individual, don't rush that bonding process, because you may miss something that will cause you to say, as much as I thought she was the one, or as much as I thought he was the one. By you allowing yourself to go through that bonding process properly and at a, if you will, a steady pace, once again, you may realize, you know what, they're not quite who I thought they was, or, you know, what I thought they would be. So instead of you continuing on another 6 months to another year to 2 years, or shoot, 5 years, you cut that off right then and there. And even as Derek, a little bit here from the book, it says, so when you are intimate with a person, some type of spiritual, verbal, emotional, mental, and physical and sexual soul tie or bond is formed, which is very difficult to break the longer it exists and is nurtured. So the longer you continue to develop and mature and nurture this bond with this person, after finding out they're really not what I thought I was looking for, or they're really not what I want, but you continue in the relationship because many of us have been taught consciously and subconsciously, oh, just stick it out, it'll work itself out. Well, everything don't work itself out. Everything do not come out in the wash. Everything don't come out in the wash. So you sit here and you spend more time with this individual after you've identified, you know what, they're not quite the one for me. But the more you strengthen that bond, the more you strengthen that soul tie, the harder it's going to be to break away from them when you finally do, or if you ever even reach the point of saying, you know what, I've had enough. Because when you have such a strong bond, when you have such a strong soul tie, your average person will not abandon that relationship, all because of that bond and because of that fortified bond and or that fortified soul tie.
You know, Nadella, I'm going to bring up, like, when me and Netta first got together, Netta made it clear she did not fry chicken.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing about it is that I'm a chicken lover.
Okay.
So she said I will go get you chicken. I'll go any place to get you chicken, but I just don't fry chicken. So I said, now, how you gonna be my future wife and you talking about you don't fry chicken? So what I did was I went out and I bought her a deep fryer.
Uh-huh.
Because you can't go wrong frying chicken in a deep fryer if it's in the deep fryer. And so she said, well, why don't you go buy me a deep fryer? I said, well, because if you're going to be my wife, you got to learn to fry chicken.
Uh-huh.
And so, funny as it is, over time, Netta actually learned to fry chicken.
Okay.
And I say that to say this. In any relationship, just because a person don't in the beginning do what you like or what you're always accustomed to, doesn't mean that they're not willing to accommodate you.
Yes.
But you have to also be willing to accommodate that individual.
Yes.
Because they have feelings, they have emotions.
Yes.
And you have to nurture that.
Yes.
So I mean, because I was a chicken lover, Netta, she pretty much said, okay, you know what? I know this is going to be your issue. So, but I'm gonna adapt and I'm gonna learn to do it. That's the type of relationship. Yes. And I'm saying that because, you know, we shouldn't jump ship because a person doesn't cater to our every need.
Right.
Because we're human and we've all grown up in different parts of life or different type of family structures or lifestyle.
But truthfully, that's part of the bonding process.
Exactly. So you have to meet in the middle. Because if you notice, people who've been married a long time,
yes,
had to compromise.
Yes. Once again, which is part of the bonding process.
And so if you don't compromise, or I think the biggest thing is that even on both sides, the man or the woman needs to understand that it's not I, because in any relationship, it's a growing process.
Yes.
And when you're bonding, you're growing together to bond together.
Yes. Yes. So I also want to share this with you. Whichever form of intimacy you spend more time in will be the one that dominates. So one of the things that I share also, okay, so let me give you this point. Meaning, if you establish sexual intimacy first, it will most likely be what governs your desire for intimacy. But it will still leave a void because we were created with other forms of intimacy. Trying to have a spiritual bond or intimacy with both God and the devil is an unwise behavior. So you have to decide, or you will find yourself in a very difficult place spiritually, mentally, emotionally, verbally, and even sexually. They are all connected and feed off each other when catered to or denied attention. And so I read all that to help us further focus on, in that bonding process, whatever form of intimacy we start off with will govern the entire relationship, unless you say, okay, I see that, all we do is, when we come together, all we do is have sex. So somebody has to pick that up and say, you know what? We need to get some verbal intimacy in here. We need to get some emotional intimacy in here, meaning dialogue. Because your average couple, their relationships are governed and driven by sexual intimacy. They're not really trying to mature the mental, the emotional, verbal intimacy. It's all about sex, sex, sex. So when it comes to having a conversation, yes.
With the sexual part of anything, is that you have to understand that eventually that gets old. Out what's going to sustain that relationship. If everything started off on sex, when you can't satisfy that person any longer, they're going to move on to the next person.
And we see that a lot.
Person, because it's all about sex.
Yes.
And you can't fulfill that need, they're going out and cheating. And then you find yourself divorced, you're finding yourself broken. Why did he leave? Why did she leave?
Mm-hmm.
It's because you have to remember what you started with.
Exactly. And this is why, even part of the bonding process, even as Derek said a little bit ago, even as we start that bonding process, during getting to know each other, and many people avoid that. They hold back, certain information. I remember one guy I was dating, and, him and I would talk. We would, have these conversations. But then after a while, I realized I didn't know as much about him than he knew about me. And I said, that's a problem. And so when I would ask him certain questions, he would give me either a sideways answer, or he would, change the subject, or, oh, I gotta go. And I'm like, what? And I put up with it for a minute. I was like, I'm like, if you cannot open up to me, especially now, mind you, let's say it's now been a year, you should be a little more comfortable with opening up with the other person. Because if you're not, then why are you wasting their time and your time? And so for 2 years, I knew just basic stuff. I knew he had a job. I knew he had a house. I knew where he lived. I knew the vehicles he drove, because he had multiple vehicles. I did know how many children he had. I knew he was married and divorced a couple of times, or a few times. He did share that both his parents were deceased. But when I went to ask about his siblings, he didn't want to talk about it. When I even, asked about his children, he didn't want to talk about it. And see, it goes to show that I am definitely a family-oriented individual, because I was sharing stuff, about my children, about my grandchildren. And at that time, my youngest granddaughter was an infant. And so he, for some reason, took a liking to her, but that was about all that I would get out of him, And so although we had a bond, it started bond. And so I had to make the decision. one-sided bonded relationship, or do I want to have a relationship with someone who's willing to bond fully? Years ago, Derek, I made the decision that even though I had been hurt before from men that I was in a relationship with, I was not going to allow that to stop me from the opportunity, for the potential opportunity to meet someone who's going to treat me right. So at one point I did close myself off, but then I was like, why? And so now at my age, I'm not afraid. Listen, if it works, it works. If it don't, you know what? Hey, I got to move on. Life is short. I'm not going to sit here. Yeah, it's going to hurt for a minute. But listen, girlfriend learned how to get over it. And so this is just further proof of the bonding process, that even as we're getting to know each other, we're going to find out there are things in particular that we may not like about each other. And that's at that point when you need to decide, do I continue with this or do I vacate the relationship?
And I think, Nadella, more so, a lot of people stay because they have to have somebody. There's nothing in anything to say you have to have anybody.
Right.
I mean, a lot of people, because I need somebody for that financial support. Well, support yourself.
Exactly.
You know, like I always used to tell Netta before we got married, I want a woman who can sustain herself, that if something happened to me today, tomorrow, they can stand on their own 2 feet.
Yes.
You have to realize that once that person goes, they take everything with them.
Yes.
So you came in with nothing and you haven't built anything for yourself.
Yes.
When that person leaves, you got nothing.
Yes. Yes.
And so you have to grow yourself. Because I always say, you know, the thing is, you don't have to be equal to me, but you got to at least have the same dream I have.
Yes.
So that means that you're going to grow with me and you're going to help me grow. And I think that's a lot of times people expect to come into a relationship based on what someone else has or what somebody else can offer them, and they settle there because they're gonna give that person exactly what they want for the time being.
Yes.
Until they get comfortable. And I think that's in the beginning of any relationship or bonding relationship. You're gonna let that person see exactly what you want them to see, that you're catering to them.
Yes.
But over time, you're gonna eventually the true you gotta come out.
Yes.
And when the true you comes out because you've been hiding him, oh, he or she is gonna expose himself more than you thought they were going to.
Yes.
So I think that in the beginning, you have to be yourself and not cater to give the other person what they want. But you need to be comfortable in who you are. And if that person can't accept you for who you are or what you have to offer, move on. Don't sit there and waste time.
Yes. Because
time is precious. You know, I remember years ago, you know, dealing in and out of different relationships, and I found out the one thing is I procrastinated my destination because I was too busy procrastinating with things I knew wasn't going to grow.
Right. And so many of us make that mistake.
Procrastinating. If it's not growing,
yes,
either get out of it or try to fix it. If it's unfixable, leave it alone.
Yes, yes. But many of us have subjected ourselves to that. And once again, it goes back to our upbringing. But we cannot fault our parents because they didn't know, because their parents didn't know, whose parents didn't know, and whose parents didn't know. So where do we stop this perpetual of part? But do we have to remain that way? Because if you're okay with mediocre, then that's what you're going to receive. But you cannot get upset when you receive mediocre and that's what you settle for. Me personally, and this is not just in relationship with a man, but this is in anything in my life. Mediocre is not even nowhere to be found near me. Me to be at a certain standard. Everything has to be at a certain level. And mediocrity, I'm not standing for. Now, I typically tell a guy who thinks he's interested into the, when I began to run down my accomplishments to them, it immediately, they walk off. Now, accomplishments to say, well, you have to have accomplished the same things or greater. What I'm letting you know is the kind of person that I am. And so if you're not that kind of person, then I'm not that person for you. Anybody who's following me on social media, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Google, you will see I got a lot of stuff going on. And it is going to take a special certain someone to be willing to deal with all this I got going on, because he's going to get swept up in it too. But it's not just one way. It goes both ways, because just like any man that I may be interested in, if he got certain things going on, I have to make that decision of, okay, do I want to deal with all that or not? And so once again, we're talking about the bond process, and this is all a part of the bond process when you decide how much time am I going to invest in bonding with this person before I am able to determine or even find out if this is the right person I should be bonding with. And so many of us have spent so many years, and I'm there with you, Derek. Listen, I've been single. My grandson will be 20 this year. That's how long I've been single. I've attempted to date, but you know what? I made that mistake repeatedly of bonding and hoping that, well, let me just give it a little bit more time, and things will probably get better. And then I'm like, okay, let me give it just a little bit more time, failing to realize that years, not days, not weeks, not months, years have passed by. But I must say that in this 20-year time that I've been single, believe it or not, most of it was at my free will, because I knew that I was fractured, damaged, whatever you want to call it. And I needed to get myself well, because I did not want to enter into another relationship all broken up, and either he take advantage of me, he abused me, or I just end up being miserable. So I remained single all these years because I needed to get myself together first and foremost. See, this is who I am. Now, I could have easily been married. Listen, I could have been married many years ago again, and that would have only been my second marriage. I've only been married once. I could have been married many years ago. I could have been married even as far as 3 years ago. I said, no, something's not right. And so I refused to get married because I wasn't comfortable with it. And although during the bonding process, everything seemed to be going well for the most part, but then, like you said, Derek, the real us started coming out. And then it was like, okay, is that the kind of person that I want to spend the rest of my life with? And so, to say that, and I'm going to open myself up to this. My first marriage was something that I became the monster in a relationship. Not physical, not mental, but it's because of the decisions I made in the military that put me in this situation. But after I got out of that marriage, and I said, I felt like I had the need to have somebody. Yes.
So I wound up in a second marriage.
Okay.
But I wasn't paying attention because I thought bonding was just spending time together at nighttime and, the sexual acts and all of that.
Yes.
And I turned around and I married that person.
Yes.
But what I found out throughout the course of that is that in the middle of a breakup is your time to fix up.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that you need to be with anybody. It means you got to know yourself.
Yes.
And figure out enemy.
Yes.
And so in my second marriage, there were key things that I never paid attention to. Number one, the individual. Because it's good when they give you gratification and satisfaction.
Yes.
But the things that you see that they're doing and you act like you don't see them. And then you turn around and you marry them and the same things are still going on after you marry the person. And you act like they never existed.
Yes. And then you're shocked.
Because see it, but it's been there the whole time. You just didn't pay attention.
Yes.
So I got out of that marriage, and then after my second marriage, my third marriage with Netta, it took me some time, 2 years to actually bond with her and get to know her.
Okay.
Because during that time, I was trying to know myself.
So you learned your lesson.
Knowing yourself is that you're not bringing anybody any garbage into a relationship without you trying to fix your own problem.
Yes.
And allowing them to fix your problem. And you're meeting in the middle that you're discussing things to fix both of you.
Yes.
And so I say that to say this is that, you know, we need to self-evaluate why our relationships are going bad.
Yes.
Are we giving too much too quick?
Yes.
Or are we playing blind and we don't see things that we know's been there?
Yes.
You know, and I told Netta in my second marriage, you know, I used to tell people, it's funny, I keep my kids around because my kids see things that I don't see in a person when I'm in a relationship because I'm supposed to be so in love.
Right.
And then they start seeing things. And then, of course, when they tell you, you get a little upset and bent up.
And my daughter did that to me.
I'm grown, and you don't need to tell me what I need to do in my relationship, and I need somebody too. But at the end of the day, your kids see things that can cause you long-term heartache, but you're not paying attention to it because you're focused on the wrong thing.
My daughter did the same thing.
My second thing is, in my second marriage, had I paid attention to the signs that my children were telling me,
yes,
I would have never gotten into it in the first place.
Yes.
Because I was so blind to things that the individual was into their own children, but neglected my children. Or when my children came around, it was a problem because everything was always just about their children.
Right.
So I'm saying that to say this. You know, don't be shamed that if somebody gives you a self-assessment of your relationship, don't get bent out of shape.
Exactly.
But somewhat take partial heed to what they're saying.
Yes.
Because maybe it's something that you're not paying attention to.
Yes. And often we're not paying attention. And that's why it is great to always have another person, you know, who's watching, because like you said, you know, we're so in love. They could bust us in the head with a brick. No, he didn't hit me in the head with a brick. No, she didn't hit me in the head with a brick. Well, why? What is all that blood running down your face? No, that's not blood. That's Kool-Aid.
Making excuses, Nadella. No, they done bust us up in the head.
Yes.
But we making excuses for them.
Yes.
There's no excuse for her.
Exactly. And so it's important that we have that bonding process. It's important that we don't rush the bonding process. It's important that we pay attention to the signs during that bonding process. I said the next time I'm going to start taking mental notes, because the last couple of times I was like, you know, I'm like, you know, even as we're talking, I was like, oh, that's not that big of a deal. But then we got down the road a little. Ooh, wait a minute, hold up. And so I started making mental, okay, so this is what this person does. This is how they are. This is mental notes. And, you know, I've been talking to you, you know, about some situations, and, you know, it's really opened my eyes and I good to be able to bounce it off of somebody else just to make sure, because I know for me, I can overanalyze. I've been told multiple times I overanalyze and I overthink things, and it's true. It's true, because I like 100%. I don't want any room for error. I don't want no room for a crack or no. It has to be 100% solid. And so during that bonding process, don't ignore the signs and don't say, oh, it'll work out, because so many people have made that same statement, oh, it'll work out, or once we get married, like Derek said, oh, once we get married, it won't be so bad, or he'll stop doing that, or she'll stop doing that. No, because you've accepted it during that bonding process, it's going to get worse once you marry them. It does not get better. In most cases, it actually gets worse. So we need to make sure that when we are bonding with that individual, first of all, we need to make sure that the right type of intimacy or intimacies is driving the relationship. The sexual intimacy, listen, I tell anybody, you can do that anytime. You can do that anytime. Leave that alone. You can do that anytime. Leave it alone. Build up the spiritual intimacy. Build up the mental intimacy. Build up the emotional intimacy. Build up that verbal intimacy, and build up that non-sexual physical intimacy, because you can always have sexual intimacy at a whim. And too many relationships rely on that as being the reason why they're in the relationship.
And Nadella, to add to that, that's why a lot of domestic violence cases take place.
Yes.
Because you knew that he or she was an abuser, because they did it to the last person.
Yes.
But you're the person that, they won't do that to me. And then all of a sudden they're doing it to you, but now you don't know no way out because the other person didn't have a way out or couldn't find no way out. And they was happy that you took that burden off of their plate. but now you got the same burden that person had on their plate, because now they're doing the same thing to you.
Yes.
You're making excuses. Oh, he loved me.
Yes.
Oh, she loved me.
Yes.
The love is not abuse.
Exactly.
I've never seen anybody in love get abused.
Never.
Anything in love, you nurture.
That's what it is. Love nurtures. Yes.
And so it's funny that I laugh at it, but people make excuses for being abused.
Yes.
I thought he loved me. No, you knew that he didn't love you.
Yeah.
It was just a self-gratification of you even providing sex for him, you're cooking, you're cleaning, you're doing everything that he wants you to do.
Yes.
And the minute that you slack on it, now he's hitting on you.
Exactly.
Because this is what you allowed. You knew it.
Yes.
You knew it separate.
Yes. And I remember when I was in high school, I started dating a guy, and I heard that he beat up his last girlfriend. And my mindset was exactly what you just said. I said, well, he ain't going to do that to me. I said, under no circumstances. And so I did ask him about it. I said, because I was like, okay, before we go any further. So I asked him, I said, so what is girlfriend? He said, it wasn't like that. He said, they got into some beef. She broke his chain or whatever. And I think he said she slapped him. So he slapped her back. And I'm like, really, dude? I'm like, you clearly outweighs her. And I know the girl. So I knew, how small she was. And I'm like, really? I said, okay, all right. So he gave me his explanation. I didn't like it, but okay. And so we continued on. And then he gets mad at me because somebody goes back and tell him that I was supposedly chatting up some other dude. And he pushes me. And I'm like, hold up. We don't do that. And so he was like, oh, I'm sorry. What do you think I did? I cut him off like a bad habit. I didn't even give it a second chance, because what would have happened, Derek? We probably wouldn't even be talking to each other except for through bars. I would have killed him if he had put his hands on me again. I would have killed him. That's the type of woman I am. You're not going to put your hands on me and think you're going to live to boast and brag about it. Not me. So I said, you know what? Let me just do this the right way. I dropped him. And then he's calling me, what's going on? I said, nothing. He was like, well, what's going on with us? I said, I don't do that abusive stuff. No, I don't abuse you, and you're sure enough not going to abuse me. And that's where I left wherever it was he was. I said, because I'm not going to deal with that. And so even in the midst of me and him bonding, because everybody thought that him and I was going to end up together. And I'm like, nah, I don't do that abuse stuff. I don't do that abuse stuff. And then he had this very arrogant attitude. I don't need you. Well, if you don't need me, then why did you ask me for my number? You know, I'm like, yeah, you psycho, homie. So I left it. I left that whole relationship, left the situation, never went back, never looked back. And that's not something that I wanted my daughter to see either. And I raised my daughter and I told her, I said, listen, if I hear of some joker putting his hands on you, I said, after I whip your butt, I'm going to whip his. And that's something that I instilled in my daughter, and I reiterated to her as she got older. And her friends, I would tell them, I said, listen, when she got pregnant with my grandson, now his father is 6'5". I walked right up to him, Derek, and I said, yo, what's the deal? And he told me after he was like, he was quaking in his boots. They were so scared, his friend ran and left him standing there. Now, he was 6'5". That's
not their family trait, Michelle, because I think that we all are so protective of our family members.
Yes.
That I don't care how short we are. I don't care how tall you are. Yeah. I'm going to stand up to you.
And Derek, I was right up, well, not quite in his grill because his grill was way up there. But I was right there in his chest. And I said, listen, this mother is not afraid of you. I said, even if you whip my butt, I promise you, you will never forget that you was in a fight with me. And he was like, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And, you know, so we have to teach these things to our children, our grandchildren, you know, even nieces and nephews and cousins. Because relationships is a part of our life. And we're not just talking about relationship with a significant other. We're talking about relationships with ourselves. We're talking about a relationship with a family member and friends. We have to no longer just sit around or stand by and knowing that that individual is in a bad relationship. And once again, even if it's with themselves, we've seen people who are self-destructive. And so our goal and desire tonight, hopefully that we achieved our goal, is to talk about the bonding process. It's okay to have a bonding process, but make sure that it's a healthy bonding process. Make sure that it's not one-sided, whether it's just them or just you. It's two people in that relationship. Therefore, two people should be working on that bonding process. Come to an agreement to say, you know what, you're a really nice person, but you're not the one for me. But it's better when you both arrive at that same conclusion instead of it just being one-sided. Don't allow yourself to get stuck just in the bonding process with somebody because you're feeling lonely and because you want to be intimate, whether it's sexually or emotionally or verbally or whatever, because a lot of people attach to people emotionally. A lot of people attach to people because they're good conversationalists. Don't allow yourself to get trapped in that bonding. A good conversationalist, or because they feed into your emotions. Because at the end of the day, they're going to realize she's too dependent or he's too dependent, and they're going to bounce. So it's good to make sure when we go through that bonding process with that significant other, with that family member, with that friend, that it is a two-person relationship. Derek, as we're going to come to a close in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to, Derek, you want to chime in one last time?
Yes. So, and you're so right, Nadella. I think the thing is, I believe in bonding with myself before I bond with anybody else, because you have to know yourself before you can get a bond with anybody else. Mm-hmm. I think that most people fail to realize or look at is that, yeah, you may need somebody at a particular time, mm-hmm. but you will never know your full self or your full potential or how you can get out of something until you work it out yourself.
Yes.
And in a relationship, that's the biggest key. If you're so scared to leave, or you give that person the energy or the opportunity to give you an excuse why you shouldn't go, and you stay stuck, it's because you have not learned anything yourself.
Yes. Yes.
Because again, people hold you in a relationship because they know your capability.
Yes.
And so when you don't know your own ability or your own goals or self-worth, then you're going to stay in something because it just feels that, okay, I'm here.
Yes.
And a lot of times people will not allow you to grow because they want you to stay stuck, because they see the full potential in you.
Yes.
And they don't want anybody to come back and say, you know what, if you would have let that girl go, and she would have been bigger than this. And no one wants to hear, no one said that anybody allowed somebody to grow up and become who they really need to be. At the end of the day, you need to figure out for yourself.
Yes.
Because, again, a lot of us procrastinate, and a lot of us hold on to time constraints because we're too scared to grow, or we're too scared to move on.
Yes.
Anything in your life say that you can't branch out.
Yes.
Because just like in life, when you left your mother's house or your father's house, or you had a child or anything, it's a new experience.
Yes.
And you learn from those new experiences, but you have to allow yourself.
Yes. And I believe we shortchange ourselves more often than a little bit, or more than we should, for sure. Because once again, that lack of knowledge that many of us are missing when it comes to intimacy. And remember, intimacy crosses every possible relationship, every possible type of relationship that we can have. And we got to develop a healthy understanding about intimacy so that we can appreciate it more, and so that we can also appreciate the relationship more, and then we can bring more to the table as well. And, you know, as Derek and I talked a couple of broadcasts ago about how people talk about, well, what are you bringing to the table? What are you bringing to the table? But nobody talks about the intimacy that they're bringing to the table, because most people's minds are stuck on that sexual intimacy. And even as I said earlier, and it's in my book in chapter 1, page 21, I talk about how whatever form of intimacy that your relationship starts on, it is most likely going to be what governs or what dominates your relationship. And so many relationships have started out with sexual intimacy, and that's pretty much what drives many relationships. That's pretty much what has caused many people to get married who knew very well that they should not be getting married. And I shared this with a couple of people, and they were shocked when I said that. And I said, you know, I don't care to be sexually intimate with a man before we get married, because that sexual intimacy will blind you. It will have you thinking that everything is peaches and cream, even though everything is just as muddy and dirty. But as Derek even said, because that sex is good, oh, well, the sex is good, that's all I'm concerned with, until he busts you upside the head, until she busts you upside the head. Now, all of no, they were crazy all along. You from seeing them for who they really are. We do tend to show signs of who we really are. But when it comes down to the intimacy, we allow that sexual piece to blind us and to ignore the telltale signs that this is not the person for me, and to move on. But we sit there and we spend a lot of time in relationships anywhere and above all that good for us. And so this is something that I've learned in my personal life about his personal life. We both mistakes, and this is what qualifies us to even be able to host this broadcast for anybody who's concerned. No, I'm not a doctor. No, he's not a doctor. We don't have no in counseling. We're just sharing about, based off of my book concerning intimacy, and how my desire and my goal, because I wrote the book, wrote my book, The Intimate Place, My God, My Man, Myself, is in hopes of us creating more healthier relationships surrounded by intimacy. And once again, it's not about the sexual intimacy. That's something we can do at any time. But it's the other intimacies that we tend not to focus on, although they are in operation. And my goal, as well as Derek's goal, because we talk all the time, not even just about intimacy, but it turns out to be about intimacy at the end of the day or at the end of the conversation. It all still comes to the head of intimacy. And many of us, we're afraid to even utter the words. Many of us, we become embarrassed when somebody mentions, nobody's not talking about sex. We're talking about intimacy. We're talking about the bonding of two people or three people or five people. And when I say three people or five people, I'm talking about if you're dealing with family members or if you got 3, 4, 5 girly friends. I'm not talking about that crazy mess, no orgy. I'm not talking about that kind of mess. I'm talking about building relationships through intimacy, the right type of intimacy. And so when we start embracing it and when we start truly respecting it, ultimately, I guarantee you we will see a difference in our relationships. And I'm telling you, as the author of The Intimate Place, My God, My Man, Myself, I've seen a difference in my relationships, not just with men, but with family members and with girly friends and with acquaintances, even with strangers. I see a difference in my relationships, in my interactions with people. Okay, Derek, I'm gonna give you one more time to chime in because I said we was gonna close, so we got 2 minutes. It's 8:28, so we're gonna shut down at 8:30. So go on ahead and say your piece.
Well, I think we've said enough, Della. I mean, I can't wait to continue this next week.
Yes.
Because again, and our subject is not just on bonding; it's about intimacy, and there's all different facts and forms of intimacy.
Yes.
So we're just trying to grow you, to based off of our experience, of what you need to look for. What signs you need to do, or how you even need to self-evaluate yourself. Because, again, we've all been there.
Yes, yes. And we're not ashamed of our past, just to let y'all know. So we are going to be talking about our personal experiences, because one thing about me, and even in my book, I share about my first marriage and what definitely went wrong in that marriage. I share my personal experiences. Why? Because I'm not embarrassed. I'm healed from my past. I'm delivered from my past. I'm no longer ashamed about my past. So we are going to even be sharing things that we've gone through and what we've experienced, and to help you to get further along in your bonding process, to help you to get further along in developing and creating a life of intimacy. We're not going to hold back with sharing our own personal experiences, because we also don't want to come off to our audience as if we've dotted every I and crossed every T. Shoot, I probably not dotted every I and not crossed every T more than I've dotted every I and crossed every T when it comes to relationships. Why? Because I did not have a manual. Derek didn't have a manual. Our parents didn't know enough to equip us. And then we also didn't know enough. We knew more, but we still didn't know quite enough to help our children. But the great thing about it is that we've recognized that we're in a better place now to, even though both of our children and we got grandchildren, we still are in a position to where we can help our children, as well as we're helping ourselves and we're helping you. So we hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. We talked about the bond or bondage of intimacy. We got into it a little bit. Next week, we're going to pick it right back up, and we're going to dig into it a little bit more. If you have any questions about anything we've said in the broadcast, you could either message me, or either you can, feel free to leave your comments in the broadcast as well, and we will definitely respond. We want to invite you to become a part of Intimate Talks community by tuning in each week Thursday at 7 p.m. and join in the discussion. This is a live and interactive broadcast, so you can post your comments and you can definitely ask your questions. We appreciate you taking time out of your schedule and spend it with us during Intimate Talk. Have yourself a wonderful and blessed evening. Good night.
Good night.